it seemed manageable at first. On the Monday before Christmas, as Winter Storm Elliott began to build, Southwest Airlines management huddled up to formulate a plan. The following day, it went into motion. After internal deliberation and after informing the pilots union, Southwest HQ began canceling flights in advance of the strengthening storm. The notice first directed customers at these airports to check if their flight had been disrupted. Then, the list of airports began to grow. So, the airline started the process of canceling flights by the hundreds. As the winter storm worsened, that call proved worthwhile. In fact, with the benefit of hindsight, they didn't go far enough. With the assumption that undergirded the decision to cancel, that they could process the cancellations early enough for customers to pivot plans and crews to reposition for new routings, proved utterly, devastatingly wrong. You know the rest of the story. Temperatures plummeted, thermometers across Denver plunged 37 degrees in a single hour, foiled travel plans ruined holidays, 5,700 flights nationwide canceled before Christmas, and while other carriers staggered along, Southwest crumbled into crisis, ultimately canceling nearly 17,000 flights and losing out on an estimated $825 million in the final 10 days of the year. It was the biggest meltdown of its kind. Some blamed the storm, others blamed the carrier's point-to-point model, while others still blamed the company's culture. But as time let the hot takes cool, a less exciting culprit came forward. A culprit that's hardly unique to Southwest. A culprit, in fact, that's less a bug and more an inherent flaw within the industry. While the biggest, the meltdown wasn't the first, and while an embarrassment to Southwest alone, it was hardly a crisis unique to the big, beloved budget airline. For Southwest, Winter Storm Elliott may have set the stage for the meltdown, but it didn't cause it. As much as anything, Southwest meltdown was a function of legacy. Southwest made its name as the pioneer of the low-cost business model through quick turnarounds and point-to-point route networks. While a typical airline will fly their plane out and right back into their hub, a given day for a Southwest aircraft might start in San Diego, then continue to Sacramento, Denver, and Nashville before finishing up in Tampa. Through this network structure, Southwest could offer non-stop flights where competitors only had one stops, and by exploiting this niche, grew into the world's 6th largest airline. But while efficient in perfect conditions, the system becomes a liability in the event of a delay or cancellation. Pilots time out, crews don't make it to their expected destination for the evening, and planes aren't positioned in the right place for the next day's flight. But weather and unforeseen circumstances, as they always have, exist. So Southwest has tools for these situations, one of which is a GE aeronautics system called SkySolver. Plug data into SkySolver on irregular operations, and its algorithms will, in the words of its brochure, execute flight schedule changes and cancellations, conduct aircraft routing and equipment swaps, and make fixes to crew assignments and pairings. That means that, if a developing storm was to roll over Denver and cause Southwest to cancel this inbound flight from Sacramento on account of the risk that the plane and crew will stay grounded by the weather, it would call on SkySolver to effectively stem the bleeding and make sure that problems don't cascade to impact the rest of the routing. After arriving in Sacramento, rather than heading to Denver, SkySolver might send this plane on a passengerless deadhead to Nashville, where the crew now nearing the end of their workday could time out and hand the plane over to the next. Of course, that's only the beginning. While finding the most cost-efficient solution is simple in the context of this single routing, it becomes orders of magnitude more complicated when considering the hundreds of additional Southwest flights passing through. Like where to reposition this 737 that normally would have been running in and out of Denver all afternoon that has both the space for the plane and can begin running services the following morning. Or what to do with the 737 that is running flights between cities in the storm's path and thus is at risk of getting stuck in a snowed-in airport. And how to make sure the later legs of this routing get flown when the plane meant to run it won't make it out of Denver that morning. Now, SkySolver is powerful enough to run up to 300 batches of cancellations in 20 minutes, but it does have limitations. First, it creates solutions to cancellations on the assumption of a static baseline. For it to figure out viable alternatives if half of Denver's flights are canceled, it needs to know that the Sacramento to Denver flight has already been canceled, and if it doesn't, or if the flight is canceled while the system's running, SkySolver solutions become less tenable, requiring reruns or manual intervention. Second, SkySolver is also limited by the data input into the system. Some of this data comes from an internal tool of Southwest's called the Baker. Dispatch processes delays and cancellations through the Baker to reconfigure routings for aircraft and passengers before the information is then plugged into SkySolver. Crucially, what the Baker's data lacks is crew information. Who's available, where, when, and for how long before they're timed out. Now, as the storm worsened and the number of cancellations increased, the limitations of Southwest Solver collided, resulting in a massive tailspin. With crews left out of the equation, the algorithm's output provided what it thought to be viable solutions, but solutions without pilots and attendants. Once these flights had to cancel close in to departure time when it became apparent that they only had half of crew, everything else unraveled as these new cancellations altered SkySolver's baseline assumptions. Effectively, the software's blind spot transformed the expected difficulties of a winter storm, hundreds of flights canceled at least 24 hours out on the 20th and 21st, into a full-blown crisis where Southwest's tools worsened problems that it then tried to fix, only to worsen things further. Through Christmas, cancellations occurred closer and closer to departure time as pilots arrived to planes with no flight attendants, while planes with no passengers deadheaded on circular, nonsensical routings like this as the software essentially panicked, positioning and repositioning planes only for the crew to time out and get stuck once again. Finally, blind as to where their own crews were, and with flawed programs providing flawed fixes, Southwest went manual, training volunteer staff at headquarters on how to process pilot and flight attendant forms and preparing for a hard reset. In the 4 days following Christmas, Southwest would cancel an incredible 10,700 flights, all because the airline failed to address a weak point that they had already identified. They had put too much pressure and stacked up too much complexity onto a fragile IT system that everyone already knew needed an overhaul. And yet, as the calendar flipped, as Southwest began to stabilize, and as more detailed reporting on the meltdown began to emerge, a new meltdown stole the spotlight. Now it was the FAA that issued a nationwide ground stop. For 90 minutes, no commercial flights took off, and for the first time since 9/11, American commercial aviation came to a complete standstill. All because a single software update went sideways, leading to important pre-flight safety communications having to be relayed manually until they could simply no longer keep up with the morning rush of flights. And the cycle began again. Upset customers, outraged press, and promises that the old technology that everyone knew would fail would be looked into. And this pattern didn't start with Southwest either. IT meltdowns hit British Airways in 2017, then in 2019, then again in 2022. They forced Delta to cancel thousands of flights in 2016 and 2017. They pushed American Airlines to cancel over 1,000 regional flights in 2018. All said they'd do better the next time, and yet all still rely on outdated, overstretched IT systems that were never designed to handle the volume of industry growth in the decades since their initial development. But the problems of old, overstacked IT systems don't stop at the back end. While customer-facing systems might look good on the surface, the most important one, the very system that makes it all possible, was created as close in time to the Wright brothers' first flight as to today. When a traveler sees this, it may look modern, but what they're actually looking at is a translation of this. Behind the scenes, Google Flights entered a query into the Global Distribution System, an interconnected set of softwares run by Amadeus, Sabre, or Travelport. In fact, specifically it entered this: AD to initiate an availability lookup, 08FEB to indicate the date, then DEN-LHR to specify Denver as the origin and London as the destination. This initiates a query from the GDS system to another, OAG, which essentially acts as the definitive source of airline scheduling data worldwide. The GDS then comes back and spits out two options, one by British Airways, one by United. The strings of letters and numbers indicate availability across the different fare classes, then the right side provides most other data: departure time, arrival time, aircraft type, and flight duration. But the fare data is still missing. For that, Google Flights needs to pick a flight, pick a fare class, then enter another query for its price. But the GDS doesn't have that data itself. It seeks the answer from the Airline Tariff Publishing Company, which, similarly to the OAG with scheduling, is the one-stop shop for pricing data used by essentially every major airline globally. So once again, the GDS will repackage their response into this, reiterating the flight schedule, then displaying the base fare, the carrier surcharge, US passenger facility charge, security fee, and international departure tax to give a total $630.20 one-way fare on the February 8th British Airways Denver to London flight. This entire process is repeated for the United option, which gives Google Flights all the information necessary to populate this screen. But next up is booking, and that's even more involved. Regardless of where a booking takes place, with some limited exceptions, the user interface is just a translation tool to input a string of commands into the GDS. This sequence initiates the process of creating a passenger name record, or PNR, to which it will then input a phone number, the name of the person making the booking, then a precisely formatted description of the desired flight itinerary. After reconfirming availability and fare price, the GDS will then submit the PNR and return with this: the time limit for actually paying for the booking. At this point, the booking is confirmed. That seat is reserved and will stay reserved unless that payment deadline passes without payment. While these days customers typically pay immediately, in the background it's rarely required, but this delay deadline gives an online travel agency like Expedia, for example, time to process and verify payment from the customer before actually paying for the ticket themselves, at which point it might become non-refundable, leaving the company in a tricky spot if a customer's credit card payment declines. But even before paying, Expedia will close out the transaction with the GDS, therefore sending the passenger name record to the airline, which will respond with a modified version including a confirmation number, which is then extracted and sent to the customer in a flashy, well-formatted email. The GDS and its associated systems were revolutionary for the airline industry. Not only did they make reservations a far less labor-intensive process, they made essentially every airline reservation system interoperable with each other. These days, it's fairly simple for airlines to sell tickets involving other airlines. They're all using the same GDS already, so the way United's internal systems interpret and modify a PNR is the same way Lufthansa's would. Theoretically, United could sell you an itinerary connecting onto an American Airlines flight. They wouldn't because they don't have a commercial partnership with the airline, but from a technical perspective, there's nothing stopping them. And if something goes wrong and your United flight cancels, the airline can and occasionally will rebook flights onto American, Delta, and others using this system. But while the GDS was revolutionary, it hardly still is today. In fact, at airports around the world, when you step up to a reservations agent, chances are the other side of their screen looks like this. Still today, in 2023, the GDS is operated as a command line interface, the way computers worked before graphical user interfaces were popularized in the 80s. Command line interfaces aren't in and of themselves an issue, but in context, the difficulty is that using them requires legitimate creativity and skill. Let's say, for example, a customer is here in Denver, headed to Zurich, and their 1:40 p.m. flight to Chicago to connect onto the 7:10 overnight to Zurich just canceled, meaning they won't make their connection. A rebooking agent would start by querying the GDS for the next available itinerary between the two cities, and they would see there's a viable one connecting onto a 7:20 p.m. Swiss Air flight out of LAX, but the problem is that the only two flights to LA that would make that, at 1:36 and 3:55, are already oversold, meaning there's no seat available for the stranded passenger. So, according to the GDS, it's impossible to get that passenger on their way to Zurich until the next day. But just because the GDS says it's impossible doesn't mean it actually is. For example, an experienced rebooking agent would know that United also flies to John Wayne Airport in Orange County, about an hour's drive from LAX, so if desperate, the passenger could fly to there, take a taxi to LAX, then make their overnight flight to Switzerland. The GDS can't offer this as an option because it's not one that the airline would sell, so it's not in the system, but with this knowledge, an agent could individually book seats for each leg, then string them together into an itinerary in the PNR. The GDS also would know that United's 11:45 a.m. LAX-bound flight was delayed until 1:30, meaning this passenger could still take that and make the connection. It also wouldn't suggest taking American's 4:10 p.m. flight to LAX as an option because Swiss Air and American don't typically ticket together, but in this exceptional circumstance, United could buy the stranded passenger a ticket on American through the GDS to continue their journey on Swiss. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. There are endless tricks to working with the GDS to solve problems, but experience is needed to know the right technique. The horrible truth this presents for both passengers and airlines is that constantly, passengers are getting stranded when they don't have to be. It's down to the luck of the draw. Is the rebooking agent you're walking up to one that's worked there for 30 years and knows the GDS like the back of their hand? Or have they just finished the limited required training to complete those simplest tasks? For passengers, this increases the frequency of getting stranded on the road, and for airlines, this increases the cost borne from issuing meal vouchers, booking accommodation, and paying for delay compensation when passengers don't get to their destination on time. And the limitations of the GDS not only create additional costs, but also prevent potential revenue. For example, Air New Zealand developed an innovative product where 3 successive economy class seats can be transformed into a short, lie-flat bed called Sky Couch. That means that those seats can be sold individually, as usual, or as a set of 3 to 1 or 2 passengers. This sort of optionality breaks the GDS. It doesn't have a way of properly communicating or reserving these sorts of transformable seats, so on the GDS, Sky Couch seats are just displayed as occupied, regardless of whether they actually are. In order to book them, one has to go directly to the Air New Zealand website. For the airline, this leaves plenty of potential revenue on the table. For example, a huge portion of the airline's traffic is ticketed through United, since United is a major partner that feeds inbound traffic from across the US to Air New Zealand's long-haul flights out of LA, San Francisco, Houston, and Chicago. Those passengers can book and check in exclusively with United, meaning they would never have even had the chance to pay Air New Zealand for a Sky Couch, and it's the same with passengers who booked through other airlines or online travel agencies. Airlines have been complaining about the GDS system for decades, and so there are an increasing number of technical solutions and workarounds to the GDS's constraints, but even those have their problems. For example, IATA introduced the new distribution capability standard, which allows for more complex back-end communication. But rather than serving as the solution to the GDS's shortcomings, it more so demonstrates what's truly at the root of the problem. 162 airlines, travel agencies, system providers, and others are certified by IATA as having properly integrated this new standard into their systems, or at least part of it. The core functions have pretty good uptake. For example, 156 of those have incorporated the NDC standard that allows for shopping for flights. But then you get to the more novel functions. SHPAN2 is a standard that allows for the sale of increasingly common unbundled ancillaries like in-flight Wi-Fi, lounge access, priority boarding, and more, meaning that, theoretically, it allows someone booking through Expedia to buy that in-flight Wi-Fi right in their checkout flow. But only 51 of the 162 are certified on this capability. And then you get into the really specialized stuff. NDC has enabled airlines to have interoperable dynamic pricing systems, meaning rather than working with the constraints of the GDS and ATPCO, which only allow for price updates a certain number of times per day, each fare would be customized for each individual consumer based on an algorithm's estimation of their price sensitivity. But to date, not a single airline is certified on this already existing revenue-generating standard. This is a familiar refrain. Airlines ask for more advanced systems are developed, then airlines don't use the more advanced systems because they decide the cost it would take to integrate them isn't worth it. And some airlines are going further, not only failing to implement new interoperable systems, but rejecting their use altogether. For example, if you search on Expedia for an itinerary between Denver and Long Beach, it'll tell you the best option is a one-stop trip through Phoenix on American, but there are actually 3 non-stop flights a day on that route. The problem, though, is that they're Southwest flights, and with limited exception, Southwest does not allow for booking through the GDS, meaning Expedia has no way to book a customer a ticket on the airline. Meanwhile, on Google Flights, which focuses on directing people where to book rather than booking itself, you can find Southwest schedules, which are filed with OAG, but you can't find fares. With no GDS sales, there's no reason to distribute fare information. This all means that nearly all Southwest bookings are done on Southwest's website, where the airline can customize and revenue optimize the booking process as they wish. The upsells are everywhere. Before confirming a fare, one gets a pop-up outlining the benefits of the next most expensive fare class. On the following screens, there's the same upsell again, an offer for a $200 credit in return for signing up for their credit card, and an option to pay for early check-in, guaranteeing one of the best boarding positions. These upsells matter. In 2021, ancillary fees made up more than $4 billion in revenue for Southwest, and that ancillary revenue is raised when customers book directly and are offered all the upsells. And in addition to increased revenue, direct booking costs less. No paying for developers to integrate their systems with others, no paying GDS fees, no paying commissions to Expedia and others. Following Southwest's lead, GDS non-participation by budget airlines is downright common these days, and the full-service network carriers are increasingly working around it to strike up direct business and system relationships with major sales channels and partners. But this is fragmenting the industry. Airlines are innovating, which is exactly what the industry should be doing, but through this individual innovation are losing the collective interoperability that has led to the globally seamless travel experience that customers have come to expect. It's almost analogous to a reverse tragedy of the commons. Each individual node in the system would grow their revenue by investing in better interoperable systems, but only if every other node did too. If only one node invests, they'll have spent money to create interoperability but still lack partners to interoperate with, meaning no revenue impact and a negative cost impact. So, in this context, each node is actually incentivized to reduce interoperability to push consumers towards their own systems, which are better designed to increase per customer revenue than the interoperable ones. It's a strategic stalemate. And this can explain the broader issue as well. There's a strategic IT stalemate. When every airline's IT is equally bad, there's little competitive incentive to improve it. Why invest to improve to a level that the public doesn't even know is possible? Globally, the airline industry has just settled on a culture of good enough. The problem, from our outside perspective, is that airlines essentially act as public utilities these days. They're the only practical means of long-haul travel and are also the only practical means for medium-haul travel in areas of North America, Russia, Australia, and other larger, less dense countries. When airlines slow down, people slow down, and therefore economies slow down. The US recognizes this fact by subsidizing the construction and maintenance of airports, and even more strongly by subsidizing airlines to fly to rural and remote communities, under the thesis that a lack of air travel options would hold back their economies. And countries also recognize this preemptively, historically treating the earliest airlines as government services and running them as state-owned enterprises, but in the century since, the trend has been thoroughly towards privatization, meaning the only real obligation is to the shareholder. So this is one of those all too common scenarios where there is a stark difference between what's good for the shareholder and what's good for the world. Therefore, it's pretty simple. Regulators need to decide whether airlines' IT antiquity is a problem for the public, and if so, do something about it. As many of you know, I travel constantly. I'm on the road more than I'm at home, and one thing that I've found is crucial to making that level of travel sustainable is having self-improvement routines that I can do both at home and on the road. That means going to the gym, on runs, and a less common one that I've really grown to love is using our sponsor, Brilliant.org. That's because Brilliant has these really interesting, well-designed courses on STEM subjects that probably seem way too hard to learn independently. Crucially, these courses are designed so you can move through them in bite-sized chunks, so while I'm at home, I might make some progress learning gravitational physics while waiting for a call to start, while on the road, you might find me doing the same while waiting for the plane to board. And what's amazing about it is that if you just do that enough times, suddenly you understand how foundational and advanced math, or AI, data science, or neural networks work. Obviously, these subjects are complex, but Brilliant makes learning them straightforward by breaking them down into their intuitive principles and by making it so you can learn anywhere and anytime thanks to their mobile app. And they have over 60 of these courses, few enough that you know they're really working on making each one amazing, while many enough that they feature all the major STEM subjects that you'd want to learn. I think it's so cool that you can learn such big, complex subjects independently at your own pace, so if you agree, you can try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/Wendover or clicking the button on screen. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription.